Hey guys, I'm Doug.
And I'm Rachel.
And today we brought Rachel in because she's smart and I'm not. And we're going to talk about how you guys watching this all think that you're basically bulletproof. But there's a whole bunch of things in your workplace that have a lot of potential damage to you that we can both identify and mitigate the risk of if we do a little bit of thinking ahead of time.
Yeah, so our goal today is to not provide medical advice. You should never take that from YouTube, but to just provide kind of an explanation of some of the basics of BLAST and how that works.
So just so you guys know, Rachel is a scientist. She actually is a scientist. There's no air quotes.
I sometimes science. My PhD is in biomedical engineering. I specialize in injury biomechanics, which is basically the various ways that human beings get beat up, injured, killed. One of the things that I did for my doctoral dissertation, that's an area of ongoing research, is blast trauma. Within the last 20 to 25 years, blast trauma to the brain has become almost a new phenomenon. And of course it had been documented before, but it was not nearly as prevalent. The reason for that is because modern body armor protects the lungs so well. So in previous wars, so example, World War II, World War I, where you still had high explosives, people were dying of pulmonary blast trauma long before they would have any issues with TBI.
That's why they call it blast lung.
That's why they call it blast lung.
Yeah.
Good job, Doug.
Hey.
Good job.
I have a history degree, which means I'm unemployable. When training is conducted in the military, risk assessment is written up by an officer or a senior enlisted guy somewhere that looks at potential dangers and ways to mitigate those dangers within training. A lot of the time, those are very obvious dangers, but when it comes to things like overpressure, we have a very low understanding of how to mitigate that risk or what even characterizes a risk within overpressure. How do we actually characterize a threshold of blast damage? Like where does it start and how do we mitigate that risk?
So that's the $1 million question. One of the things we've gotten really good at as a field is measuring the blast exposure. That's still not being done ideally in an actual combat scenario, but in a training scenario, there are now systems that are available and exist to put blast gauges in place so that there's a better idea of what each of these weapons in each of these scenarios are exposing people to. The problem is that for some of these milder injuries, especially the ones that accumulate over time, we still don't have a lot of knowledge about what level is dangerous. So for example, we might know, because this has been going on for 100 years, exactly how far away you need to be in an open field from a 20-kilo bare TNT charge. We have standoff distances that are reasonable for that in terms of the lungs, in terms of shrapnel. But in terms of the brain, it's only within the last several decades that people have really developed the tools to measure a lot of these cognitive deficiencies that people are reporting based on noticing it themselves in their everyday life.
Well, and the VA, as I recently have learned, isn't actually still correlating those symptoms to that instance of injury. It's not easy for them to say that it's a service-related injury. The end user, people who are watching this video, need to be cognizant of what are those incidents that are bringing on those things? Like, how are we determining that the current activity we're engaging in is peligroso? For all you non-Spanish speakers, that's dangerous.
Well, that's actually a really good question also. There still aren't great standards for that for every environment because what you guys do in training can be so varied. And a lot of the times the environment can be so complicated, it's not always obvious what sort of a blast exposure each different configuration is going to create. One of the major goals for people who are doing research right now is trying to find those pressure levels and those blast durations that are going to be causing the most damage in a way that's meaningful to the end user so that we can then instrument people during training and tell them real time, you've just been exposed, you need to do this as a response. What I often recommend is if people are concerned about what they're getting exposed to, just keep a basic log. It's very difficult to remember all this stuff years later. Human memory, in the best of circumstances, is terrible.
Especially when your brain's getting...
Right. There's also a lot happening there, right? They're complicated situations. You might not be focused on measuring exactly how far away you were. If you write it down right away, you're going to have a log of that that's going to be a lot more reliable than if you try and remember what happened 5 or 10 years later.
I mean, it's also worth noting that I think that like recording that specific training block is easy. It's like just saying, hey, we we detonated charges. We don't know if we were close enough or far enough. I mean, following the minimum safe distance procedure still hasn't set us up for success.
Right.
We're still guys that want to be through the door faster. We want to be closer. And we find that like if an explosion doesn't result in unconsciousness, then it wasn't dangerous.
Right.
So like even though I know the minimum safe distance is 3 feet, I know that I can get like 2 feet away and ride it because I want to go through the door and I'm not going to like pass out.
But also something that's really important for us researchers to keep in mind is there are situations where you guys don't have that choice. Your choice is, okay, if I flirt with this minimum safe distance now, but it'll save my life immediately, then it might be worth the long-term risk. And I don't have the ability to make that choice for anyone else. So what my job is to provide guidance kind of after the fact about what that might have done, what needs to happen in terms of looking at your cognition and things like that later.
So you're measuring through helmet sensors, which is like at least the only one I've seen, right?
Well, so I don't personally have any projects with helmet sensors right now, but in general, yes, helmet sensors are one of the ways that people are looking at TBI in this population. Okay. And that's kind of one of those things that's continuously improving. Like by the time this video is posted, it will probably be outdated about helmet sensors because it is such an important area that people are working on this constantly. And they're not perfect yet, but that's how science goes. We need an iterative process to get to what will be the ultimate working solution. But if you have this information about yourself and your exposures, that lets you go out and do your job as the science develops alongside you. So what we know now is infinitely more improved compared to what we knew in 2003. But the people...
What?
Yeah. There's been 20 years of science, which actually is, on a scientific scale, not very long. So that's something that's really important to know as well. 20 years of progress in the world of science is quite short. But if you have this ability to have a documentation of what you've been exposed to, then that lets you maintain that record as the science improves around you, and then people can look at it retroactively with the knowledge they gain in the future.
Well, and for everybody watching this video, it helps to have those things written down because later when you're going to file a claim with like the VA or trying to tie feelings that you have that you can't put your finger on to an incident, having it written down in a timeline goes a long way. Is it true that if I put my fingers in my ears and open my mouth, I am no longer going to suffer blast damage internally?
Only if you're a cartoon character.
That is what I was taught when I was in 2003.
Yeah. That whole recommendation of, putting your fingers in your ears actually might help your ears, but that's not how the blast overpressures are affecting your brain. They don't travel in that way.
Why was I opening my mouth?
I actually worked really hard to trace where that came from. Do you want to know where that came from?
Yes.
It came from a single paper that was published in 1943 where a bunch of dudes gathered around some rabbits and blasted the rabbits while trying to estimate what breath cycle the rabbit was in before they pushed the button. So they were all like, I think the rabbit was exhaling. And that was pretty much how they mashed that together. And it's become a piece of misinformation.
So the rabbits all open their mouths?
Until 1943. Yeah, so what they were saying was basically, we think the injuries are worse when the rabbits have inhaled versus when the rabbits have exhaled. There is absolutely nothing to that. It
sounds reasonable to me. So when we go to the demolition range and we blow up 300 pounds of explosives, everybody knows they need to be in the bunker, which needs to be a minimum 6 distance away. And like, even if you feel some of the shock in your body, most people aren't feeling sick after those range days. What would you qualify as risky activities that maybe people aren't aware of in their day-to-day, like conducting training?
I think one of the riskiest activities that people don't think about is in closed spaces or even standing near reflecting surfaces. For example, if you have someone who's standing next to a wall, their blast exposure is going to be much larger than someone who's farther away from that wall, even if they were the same distance from the explosion.
Which is an echo chamber.
It is, right. So when you start to put multiple walls in there, that's when you have an echo chamber, and it's named that for a reason. The echoes become louder than the original noise. That same thing happens with blast over pressure. The waves will add together and create a pressure that is higher than the original explosion. It's also important to know that because there's echoing, now it lasts for longer. So that overpressure duration is also one of the key parameters that informs your risk of injury. So now when you have any kind of enclosure, you've made that worse.
There's small risk factors that are still big risk factors in the sense that the blast, we don't think it's big because it's a small bullet, but the blast is still there and it's still echoing in the room, and it still
has a potential. Like
Yep.
the size of the bullet doesn't necessarily indicate the size of the blast.
Yep.
And something that the good news about those scenarios is that in air, blast over pressures fall off. We call it by the power of 3.
Yep.
So every inch you are away, you're raising that to the power of 3. It's multiplying in triplicate. So every inch you are away helps you so much more than just like the linear progress of just moving that distance. So anything you can do to move away from that muzzle area is automatically going to be a huge help.
I guess I bring those things up because I think about the fact that, like, when we talk to guys that are suffering different symptoms, there's kind of like levels of symptoms that guys are experiencing, and a lot of time they're not necessarily tying them to the specific incidents that led to that. Because if you're feeling depressed, most guys aren't just like, oh, well, of course I'm feeling depressed because my brain is no longer functioning the way that it was or that's supposed to function to process my emotions or whatever. That's to say, how are we defining, like, what are the impetuses for those different levels of traumatic brain injury, and how do we mitigate some of those things?
Okay. This is a complicated question because TBI can be so varied in the way that it presents and in the way that it happens, which means that there are multiple parts of the brain that can be affected, and that means that you're probably going to have different symptoms based on which part of the brain is the most impacted. For example, if you have something like a blunt force trauma, that's a different kind of TBI, and you tend to have a far more localized injury to the brain than you would with a blast. So most people are familiar with the idea of a concussion. Now concussions are, in the medical world, starting to be relabeled as mild traumatic brain injuries. So we're fitting them into this spectrum of how traumatic brain injuries can present. But that alone tells you how diverse these injuries can be, because I know I've had buddies who've gotten serious concussions versus mild concussions, and even externally they look very different. But those are all still fairly lumped into the mild to moderate region. With severe TBI, there's usually no ambiguity that it's happened. So we don't even need to go into that. This is where we're talking
Extended periods of unconsciousness,
even skull fractures, things like that. It's usually pretty obvious.
A brain bleed. They're like there'll be some kind of intervention going on.
Exactly. Okay. It's usually pretty obvious. The ones where people start to get worried about what to look for are the mild to moderate range, which makes sense. So a lot of people have these feelings and these sensations, and they don't necessarily know if it's related to TBI or not. That's where there's bad news, is because those symptoms haven't been super specifically classified into TBI or not TBI. They might be related to your traumatic brain injury. They might be related to other issues happening physiologically at the same time. For example, TBI and post-traumatic stress have a ton of overlap in the symptoms. But the reason it's important to seek care for your particular symptoms is because while they have tons of overlap, they can often be mistaken for each other. They have very different treatments.
Once we have symptoms we think are related to TBI, how are we going to go to the doctor and get an assessment? Like, what assessment determines if there is TBI?
So the Gold Star assessment right now, as of when we're recording, again, fast-moving field, so this might be outdated, but as of right now, the best assessment is something called eye tracking. What they do is they sit you in a dark room, dark tent, something like that. They put you next to a camera and they're watching the way that your eyes move. The reason for that is because beneath the surface of your brain, you have what are called cranial nerves. These are actually one of the more delicate parts of the brain and the nervous system in general. They feel real squishy, Doug. So when you have a traumatic brain injury, these cranial nerves, because they're so delicate, they're one of the first things that can be injured. And so they provide kind of a frontline assessment for whether or not you should be looking for more serious problems. And a lot of the cranial nerves are related to eye motion. So that's why this eye tracking software and this technique is going to be really good for looking at, do you have a deficit right now? Is your brain not functioning quite as normal?
And that's generally available.
It's unfortunately not as available as it should be. It should be available to many of these communities where they're doing this stuff regularly. There are other assessments now when they don't have that physical setup available to them. For example, there's a common balance test called a BESS. It's an acronym for something, and they're forcing different parts of your brain to activate because the brain is really good at compensating. The brain is really good at coming up with ways to convince you that nothing has happened. And one of the ways it does that is it has multiple mechanisms for balance. So for example, loss of balance, loss of coordination is a TBI symptom. And some of these balance tests will force you to do activities that are going to be more revealing than just normal everyday life. There are also cognitive tests that you can take on the computer, which look at words and memory and whether or not you remember the sequence.
There needs to be a baseline for that, though, right?
There really needs to be a baseline for that.
Which I know the military was trying to do for a while, but they were inconsistent in the application of the testing, so I don't think that they were getting good data.
Right, and so there needs to be a baseline for that. And the statistics on it are also difficult, so it may or may not pop up as you being different, or you might just be really tired that day. And a lot of people, I hear this, please don't do it, are trying to tank their baselines on purpose, so there's lower risk that they'll get pulled if they have an actual brain injury.
What are ways at the end user level that we can mitigate risk? We can say, hey, we did X training. We know that there's a higher probability that an injury occurred in every one of our soldiers. And now we're going to take what measures to ensure that they heal properly and we're not introducing them to another traumatic injury on the heels of the first one that they had.
Yes. Okay. So number one, we've already talked about, which is that with blasts, specifically blasts in air, tiny distances make a massive difference. So anytime there's ability to move even slightly further away, that is helpful, even if it's a little bit. The second one is positioning. For example, because blast physics is so weird, if you are next to a wall, you're actually exposed to a minimum of double the blast exposure, up to 9 times the blast exposure, just by being next to the wall where it reflects. So if you can reduce it by 8/9 by moving farther away, that's worthwhile. The same thing applies with any kind of enclosed spaces or anytime there's a reflecting surface. There are basic things you can do to reduce the amount that they're going to reflect. There's cheap anechoic foam, like they use in sound booths. There are different types of rubbers. We actually use those in science world to set up blast rooms and control our waveforms intentionally. And then the last question is about protecting the people after they've been exposed. So you suspect something has happened, or at the very least, you've had a day where there's the potential for something to happen. With traumatic brain injury, one of the most nefarious things that can happen is something called second impact syndrome, which is where you have a first injury and you think everything is completely fine and you feel completely fine. And it's actually a completely recoverable injury. But then a second insult happens that's within a short time frame, usually within days or maybe a week or two. And that second insult will multiply with the first one. Now, all of a sudden, you have a bigger injury than either one of them alone. So avoiding second impact syndrome, I know you're about to make a sarcastic joke.
I was, but I decided to swallow it to be more like, what's a good amount of time between the first insult and the second insult
Yeah.
so that my fragile brain isn't insulted.
It's not, it's one of those things that's not 100% clear because I'm not allowed to hit people in the head on purpose.
Yeah.
For the name of science. So we don't 100% know, but it's on the order of days to a couple of weeks. So if you suspect there's been a brain injury, that's a good time to take other types of training. For a long time, the wisdom has been after a concussion, you should basically lay in a dark room with your feet up. Now the research is showing that that's not necessarily the case, that it may actually be healthy to have a higher level of activity, which often means that it's still safe to be able to do other things. And of course, this is all actively changing research, so any individual with an injury should talk with whoever's treating them specifically. But it does mean that if someone is planning these activities, they can plan it in a sequence such that there's a break between them.
So when you're planning out a training calendar and you have CQB or whatever terminology you're using to describe working in an enclosed space with explosives and muzzle blasts, it's a wise idea not to schedule an airborne operation that possibly has head trauma impact the week after or days after, et cetera. Like if you could space these training incidents out and fill the white space with your admin activities that everyone is so upset about. Maybe, I don't know, get a vaccine. I think that the big takeaway that you guys as viewers need to see in this video is that traumatic brain injury and blast exposure or concussions are affecting everyone equally. There's no amount of like tough guy scenario that's going to help you walk through this and be more whole on the other side. What is required is more planning, more mitigation, and just more general concern about our overall health.
Traumatic brain injury oftentimes becomes one of the things that people try to quote power through because some of the symptoms feel emotional or they feel less physically specific. They're coming from your brain, right? The reality is these are physical injuries. Nobody considers it a sign of weakness when you break your arm. But for some reason, that stigma is associated to TBI and it shouldn't. So I just want people to start recognizing these as the actual physical traumas that they are and realizing that it's not a reflection on them as a person.
If you guys found this video helpful, make sure you ring the bell and click subscribe to see more content from us. Also, visit SOFLETE.com for all of your fitness and nutritional needs.
And awesome t-shirts.